Well, when I first moved to Houston, it took me a little bit of time to figure out how to make my way around the city. You see, I had no familiarity with the city of Houston. I had only ever grown up in small towns, and so when I moved here, this was easily the largest city that I had ever lived in. And so to figure out how to navigate it, I decided, okay, you know what? The street names, they'll come in time, but what I'm going to do in the interim is I'm just going to pick out landmarks, like things that really just, I know what they are, where they are, and as I look towards them, I can set my car in that general direction, and it will get me where I'm going. So the first thing that I took note of, I work here at Houston's First. So I thought, okay, there's an Embassy Suites right behind the church, and it is a tall building with a green roof. Hard to miss if you're trying to find the church. The second thing that I took note of was Memorial Herman's Crown Tower. You know the one I'm talking about? That is in the direction of where I live. And so I was like, okay, if ever I want to get home from the church, I set myself in that general direction, I'll be able to find myself. The third landmark that I learned about pretty early on was a graffiti mark called Toe Flop. It's all across the city, but it's specifically at a railroad bridge just before you get to Washington Avenue. Have you seen this before? You know where this is at? Toe Flop is all over the city of Houston. Whoever he or she is, they're everywhere. Like not just on that railroad bridge, but they're also on concrete pillars on the bayou. They've marked their tag on abandoned gas stations. They've even put themselves at the very top of a 30-store abandoned apartment complex. I don't know how. I have no idea who this person is, but that is a modern marvel, people. Toe Flop, saw him everywhere. And so, given Toe Flop's infamy across not just our city, but what I learned across kind of the South, because they're not just here in Houston, they're in Austin, they're also in New Orleans, and they're in Memphis, of all places. Whoever this guy, this girl is, they have marked their tag everywhere. Given their infamy, I had to look them up. So I got to learn more about this person. I need to figure out who is Toe Flop. And so I started doing research. I couldn't figure out who it was. If you know, you can come talk to me later. I would love to figure out exactly who this person is. But I did learn some things about Toe Flop that I think are interesting that you would want to know. The first thing is this. In the subculture of contemporary American graffiti writing, Toe Flop has reached a ubiquitous status known as going all city, which just means they have reached a certain level of recognition where other graffiti artists recognize their work. They've reached a specific level where they will be remembered for a long time coming. And what you also learn as you look up Toe Flop is you realize that they're not gang-related in nature, that they've adopted this moniker, this name, because they actually want to distinguish themselves from gang-related graffiti. They want to instead make art. And so they have decided to take a name that doesn't necessarily have any significant meaning, at least to the public eye, so that they can be able to put themselves out and people can take notice of their work. And here's the thing about graffiti. Graffiti is illegal in most cases, which begs the question, why? Like, why would you do this? Why is Toe Flop, in a world where their anonymity is so important, why are they taking the risk night after night to continue to spread their name all across the city of Houston? That's the first question. And as we see their name, it begs the second question. Who's Toe Flop? Like, will the real Toe Flop please stand up? I would love to know who it is. And so, we may never know who this person is. But I think that Toe Flop is actually a helpful reference for us as we come to the passage we're studying tonight. You see, because just as Toe Flop, how many times have I said it by this point? Just as they have gone all city, Jesus, for 3.5 years to the point of the passage we're studying tonight, has gone all city himself. You see, he has, over the course of his ministry in the region of Galilee and then across the Judean countryside, he has done certain things where he has left his tag across the area of the ancient Near East. And he's causing people to question, who is this guy? Like, who is this Jesus? Who performs miracles like this? Is he a rabbi, a prophet, a miracle worker, a teacher? Like, who is he exactly? People are begging the question. And until this point, Jesus hasn't just come out and said who he is. Like he's revealed it to us in small details. Like we can connect the dots, right? We can look at his story and we can see, okay, he is the King of Israel. Like we can get the idea as he reveals some of who he is in secret to people. But the reason I set all of that up for you is because tonight, as we come to Matthew chapter 21, Jesus steps into the spotlight, people. He's not beating around the bush anymore. He graffitis his name, his title in bold, big letters for the world to see that he is the King of Israel. He is the King of Kings. And he wants everyone to take notice, and he wants us to take notice tonight too. So if you have a Bible, you can go ahead and grab it. Matthew chapter 21 is where we're going to be. And as we look at it, we're going to see that Jesus walks through a couple of different passages, and in the process, teaches us a couple of things about himself. You see, in this series, Literal King, if this is your first time, we have been looking at what kind of king Jesus is. There was no message more central to Jesus' ministry than this, that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. It's here. And I'm the king, is what he's saying. And so it begs the question, what kind of king are you? And we've seen he's humble, he's powerful, he's unexpected, he's relational, he's global. And tonight what we'll learn is that Jesus is a confrontational king. A confrontational king. And as we look at it, we'll see what he wants to confront in our lives specifically. So here we go, Matthew 21. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read all the way through this passage, and then we're going to talk about it, okay? So it's 11 verses. Hang in there with me. Matthew 21, starting in verse 1, it says, "Now when they," talking about Jesus and his disciples, "drew near to Jerusalem, and they came to Bethphage," it's actually pronounced Bethphage. It's house of the early fig is what this would have been. "To the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, and he's saying to them, 'Go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord needs them, and he'll send them at once.'" We don't know if Jesus has prearranged this. We don't know if this is by divine design. We don't know if he has actually coordinated all this with another disciple. We don't know. All we know is that Jesus will give the word and he will get what he needs. And so he's asking, hey, bring me a donkey, bring me a colt, have them brought to me. Because this takes place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, Zechariah, saying, "To the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden." The disciples went and they did as Jesus had directed them. Good idea. They brought the donkey and the colt and they put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. He sat on them. He didn't sit on both of them. He sat on their cloaks. Most of the crowd, they spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and they spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and those that followed him were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowd said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." So Jesus is a confrontational king. Where's the confrontation in that passage? Anybody find it? It's right at the end. It's right when it says the whole city was stirred up. What does that mean exactly? Like the whole city was stirred up. Like you kind of stir in your sleep, right? Or you can stir something up. Well, the Greek for that word, it literally means to shake something or to agitate something. It would be like taking a snow globe and shaking a snow globe and trying to stir up all the snowflakes within the globe. That's essentially what this Greek verb is meaning. And so what we learn is that it's used in a couple of other places to help us get an idea of what it's saying. Matthew 27, verse 51, it says, "And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook." That's that same word. It shook, and the rocks were split. Matthew 28, 4, "And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men." That's the same word, to stir up. It shook, it trembled. So the city is shook, is basically what we find. And it's clear that Jesus is making some very intentional moves here as he challenges them concerning what they actually think about him. And as he challenges them, he's going to challenge us. And it brings me to the first of 2 points that we're going to see in the 2 passages we're looking at tonight, that Jesus confronts our ideas. He confronts our ideas of who he is. Whatever ideas you have about Jesus, he wants to confront those to make sure they're actually true. And so he's going to do it in this passage. So what ideas is he confronting specifically right here? Like, what is he actually addressing? Well, for us to figure it out, we have to pay close attention to what he's doing. Because these events, can we just be honest, they seem really weird. Seems pretty strange. Odd set of circumstances that he's asking for these different elements as he makes his triumphal entry. And yet, though they seem random, even abnormal, they're very strategic. Jesus is incredibly intentional about the way that he is going to move into Israel. So first, we have to see that Jesus, he is en route to Jerusalem, and on the way, he stops in this town called Bethphage, which would have just been east in the suburbs of Jerusalem. Literally, it would be like this. If we ourselves were here in Bethphage, it's the distance from where we are to Memorial Park. It's that close. He's not going far. It's a little over 2 miles in total distance. And so he sets it up and he says, hey, disciples, I need you to go into town. I need you to find a donkey and a colt. It'll actually be there immediately when you arrive. And you need to take those 2 animals and bring them to me. If anybody asks, hey, what are you doing? You just tell them the Lord has need of them and they'll release them to you. And so they go and they get it. They bring it back to Jesus. And what we find is that they do so willingly. Like, not just because they're obedient, but because though this is odd to us, there's actually precedence for this. That in the ancient Near East, like, kings would ride one of 2 animals. They would ride in on a steed whenever it was time for war. Or they would ride on a saddled donkey in times of peace. Like, there's a precedence for this. Like, Jesus is doing something that would have been normal in the culture. And it's not just that it's normal in the culture, it's the fact that Jesus' own ancestors, King David, King Solomon, they both did this themselves. They both rode in on donkeys in times of peace. And so he's following the example of those kings that came before him, the very kings that he comes from the line of. He's following suit. But it's not just that. Like, it's also to fulfill the words of Zechariah 9 right here in verse 5. What is Zechariah saying? He's saying, hey, the Davidic king, he will return to Zion. That was the capital city of Israel. He will return. And with him, he will bring final salvation. Not through strength, but he'll bring salvation through peace. He's not going to be a conquering king on the back of a noble steed. He's going to be a peaceable king, one that comes weak, low, humble, because he seeks to bring with him peace and tranquility to all people. That's what salvation for the people of God looks like. And what we see is that Jesus, he doesn't just ride on any colt. We don't see it in Matthew, but if you go and you read Mark, what you see is Mark says, hey, go and get me a colt upon which no one has ever sat before. Which seems like a pretty unwise request. I don't know about you. We went to the Houston Rodeo a little while back, and there's this event at the Houston Rodeo called, what is it called? Calf scrambling, the calf scramble. You know what I'm talking about? This is that event where they release high school students to chase down baby cows all over NRG Stadium. And what you find is something really interesting about the relationship between animals and people. What we learn is that animals and people don't necessarily cooperate with one another because there's no trust in the relationship. And so you see high school students scrambling after these steers. They finally catch them. They put a halter on their face and they drag them back to the center of the arena. And yet, despite their greatest effort, what do these baby cows do? They pull back. Thank you, Raj. Yeah, they dig their heels into the ground. Like, they don't want to go. They don't trust willingly that they're being taken care of. And if this is true for these cows, it would be true for this colt. Like, think about it. This colt does not know Jesus. These calves do not know these students. And yet, this colt, though he has no reason to trust Jesus, is able to be saddled, ridden, and journeyed all the way into the city of Jerusalem amidst screaming crowds. Like the normal population of Jerusalem, anywhere from 20 to 50,000. This is during Passover week. There's 150,000 people here. And they are screaming for Jesus, Hosanna. And yet this colt, young, skittish, never before ridden, it carries Jesus tranquilly all the way through the masses. You see, Jesus, he does this not just to say, hey, I'm the king of Israel. He does it to say that he's the king of creation. He doesn't just come to rule and to reign over you and I. He has come to rule and to reign over everything. And as he rides this foal, it says that he does so from the east. This is really symbolic. This is a lot of Bible study tonight. As I was prepping for this evening, I was like, I don't have a bunch of cool points for you. We're just going to read the passage, and I'm just going to unpack it. And so what we find is that he journeys from the east. Why is this symbolic? Because anytime there's cardinal directional language in the Bible, it's intended for a very specific purpose. Like what we learn in the Old Testament specifically is that anytime the people of God journey to the east, they are moving absent from the Lord. And anytime they journey to the west, they are moving towards the presence of the Lord. Just to give you some examples, Adam and Eve, once they sin, they are driven east from the presence of God. When Cain murders his brother Abel, he wanders east from the presence of the Lord. In Genesis 11, it says the whole earth traveled east before constructing the Tower of Babel. Abraham and his nephew Lot, they go different directions in Genesis 13. Abraham goes which way? He goes west, Lot goes east, and eventually he ends up in Sodom and Gomorrah. That doesn't go well for him. Israel, they were led captive by both Assyria and Babylon to the east, away from the presence of God. The entrance to both the tabernacle and the temple, they face east. Why? Because they're ready to receive those that are journeying back to the presence of God. The wise men, New Testament, they saw the star and they traveled from which direction? From the east. They're heading west towards the presence of God, to the baby Messiah. I remember for myself in college, I grew up in deep East Texas, in the Piney Woods. And so when I went to college, every time winter break would roll around, I would make the journey back, the inevitable journey back to my hometown. And what I found whenever I would go east is that I would journey back into old habits of sin, like old patterns of thinking. I would revert back to the life that I once had when I was growing up in high school in my parents' home. There's nothing wrong with my parents. My parents are great people. Nothing wrong with my hometown. I love Longview, Texas. There was something about being, though, in a place where ungodly decisions had just run rampant for me. And yet what was amazing is when I would arise and I would set my face to the west and I would return to the promised land that is Texas A&M University, I would find that my spirits would lift. Like my attitude would improve. Why? Because it was there in that place where the presence of God was most active in my life. It was there with him that I was walking in near relationship. So why does any of this matter? Why does all of this directional jargon matter to you? Because Jesus is coming from the east too. He is journeying back to the presence of God. He, as our substitute, is moving from the place that is absent of God's presence due to the sin that we have inflicted towards the presence of God that only he can offer. Jesus is moving from the east, and he's trying to take you and I with him. And yet there's another layer to this. This thing just keeps going. It's not just that he's heading east, that he's not just representing man's movement towards God, but he is representing God's movement towards man. What do I mean by that? Just real quick, we don't have time to jump into it and read, but when you go and you read Ezekiel, what you see in Ezekiel 9, 10, and 11, you should go look at it yourself. You see that the very presence of God, the glory of God, because of the sin, wickedness, and evil of the nation of Israel, indulging in the most vile of practices, things like child sacrifice. He decides that the presence of God, the glory of God is going to depart from his people because he doesn't tolerate it. He doesn't endorse evil living. He moves away from it. And so what you see a devastating passage in which the glory of God departs from the Holy of Holies, that innermost sanctum in the temple. He leaves that place, and it says that he exits the east gate. And he doesn't just exit the east gate, he goes all the way out to the Mount of Olives. And it's a devastating prophecy, because will he return? And yet when you turn to Ezekiel 43, you see, it says this, that the glory of the Lord, the God of Israel, he was coming from the east. And the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. Jesus is coming from the east. He is the glory of the Lord returning back to the very presence of his people, to the temple. It's so profound. It's like in Lord of the Rings, the Battle of Helm's Deep. What does Gandalf say to Aragorn? He says, "Look to my coming on the first light of the 5th day. At dawn, look to the east." Gandalf is doing exactly what Jesus does here. Why? Because he is representing the deliverance for the armies of mankind from the evils of Mordor. And just like Gandalf, Jesus is doing the same thing. He is offering deliverance to all of mankind. That as he comes from the east, in his wings, he brings peace. He brings salvation. He brings rescue from all the sin and devastation in our life. That's what Jesus is doing. So we have to see it. He's arriving from the east as the glory of God, as the Son of David, mounted on a king's colt, seeking to bring peace to all people. And as he does, hundreds of thousands of people are thronging about him on all sides. And for us, this sounds like a pretty glorious thing. Like, man, that would have been awesome. I would have loved to have been there. Like, this is not an awesome scene for everyone in Jerusalem. Like, to put it in a modern context, it would be like Jesus announcing his presidential candidacy and marching on the White House, not waiting for anybody to vote him into office, but simply saying, "I am president, and I have arrived, and all of these people believe in me, and we are going to march to the Oval Office." That's what he's doing here. How would that make you feel? Pretty uncomfortable. We lived through it, and it was a weird time in our nation. Jesus is doing that himself. And yet the significance of it is Jesus is no longer concealing, but revealing his identity. Like, he's not beating around the bush anymore. He is the King of Israel, the long-awaited Messiah, the Son of David himself. And as he comes, he contests you and I. He confronts us in our ideas about him. And he causes us to ask, what do you think of this guy? Do you agree with him? Or have you mistaken him for someone else? Because Jesus does not give you any room to negotiate. Like, he's not some wise moral teacher. He's not Mother Teresa or Gandhi. Like, he's not simply some revolutionary leader like Spartacus or William Wallace. He's not a profound spiritual prophet or teacher like Buddha or Muhammad. Like, that's not who Jesus is. Jesus is declaring, "I am the Son of God, the King of Kings." If you have mistaken him for anyone else, he is here tonight to confront you, to set the record straight. You cannot worship him for anything less than this, that he is the Lord. And he has come for us. And so the question for us, just to make this really applicable, is, do you see him rightly or not? Like, Jesus, he is confrontational, not just because he's aggressive, like, he has a purpose. So why is he confrontational with us? Because it begs the question. He wants to make sure we ask ourselves, have we missed him? And if we've missed him, how did we do it? How did we mistake him for someone else? Well, what we're going to see is that he's going to give us two different ways to zero in, to make sure that we see him rightly. But the first is this, that we miss Jesus when we mistake him for someone else. We miss Jesus when we mistake him for someone else. What do I mean? This is what the crowds hailing his arrival do in this moment. Like, it looks like they're getting it all right, and yet they have mistaken him. They have the wrong idea about who Jesus is because they think that Jesus is coming to rescue them from political oppression by Rome, and yet he's coming instead to rescue them from the spiritual oppression of their souls. Like, he's not the king that they want, he's the king that they need. And yet they have made a grievous mistake because they are hailing his name as someone that he is not declaring to be. And what we find is that we do the same thing. Like, we can get Jesus wrong. We can miss him because we can mistake him, because we can make him out to be something that he never promised to be for us. Like, we can ask Jesus to advance our agenda or to help us get whatever it is that we're striving to accomplish, or help us to reach that next rung on the corporate ladder, or whatever it is that our goals, our destinations in life are. We're asking Jesus to help us get there, and yet he hasn't promised to do it. That's not why or who, it's not why he exists or who he is. And here's the reality. Like, I was thinking about this myself. I will just be honest with you. Do I personally feel like someone that comes to Jesus and is treating him like a genie in a bottle? Like, come on, Jesus, get me what I want. No, I don't do that. I feel pretty guiltless of this accusation. Do you? Like, do you treat Jesus like this, or do you actually kind of leave him on the throne that he is rightly claimed to own? And yet, though I felt guiltless, I was like, you know what? Anytime I feel like I'm actually not at fault, I probably should do a second check. And so I asked myself the question, how do I discern if I'm actually mistaking Jesus in my life or not? Well, we learn from the crowds. What are they doing? They're worshiping Jesus with all of the intensity that he deserves, yeah? Like, what are they doing? They're laying down their cloaks and they're making a runway for him to walk upon. They're snapping branches off the trees and they're waving it as a symbol of the Messiah to come. They're declaring out loud, Hosanna, Hosanna, Lord, save us. Like, they're giving him all of the sort of worship that he deserves. And does he deserve it? Yes, absolutely. But the issue with the crowds, and don't miss this, the issue with us when it comes to worshiping Jesus is not found in the magnitude of our worship, but the motivation behind our worship. You see, these crowds, they have mistaken him. They are celebrating him for someone he never promised to be. And the reason we know it is because in Luke 19, Jesus says this, he weeps over the city of Jerusalem because they did not know on this day the things that promised to bring peace. They missed him because Jesus is triumphantly entering. His face would have been one of weeping because they missed it. Friends, I don't want you to miss it. Do not mistake Jesus. Do not mistake him for someone else. If you want to know whether you're seeing Jesus rightly for who he is, then you have to ask yourself the question, what is motivating my worship? What's motivating my worship? Or here's another way of thinking about it. Do I worship, genuinely worship, in all circumstances? Or do I only worship you, God, when things are going my way? And I'm talking about genuine worship. Like, I'm not saying like, oh yeah, I show up and I sing some songs. You better be careful if you're doing that. Do you genuinely worship him no matter what the circumstance may be? Listen, if your worship, the gratitude of your heart in response to the goodness of God, if your worship ceases because you can't find the right guy, you can't find the right girl, you can't find the right job, you can't get the right answer to that prayer, you can't find the right solution to that problem, I don't know what it is. If your worship ceases because he's not giving you what you want, you're not worshiping King Jesus. you're worshiping some other idea of him. He has come to confront that tonight. And I'm not trying to be aggressive, but if you feel some conviction, that is from the Spirit. I can't give you that. That's from the Lord. And so I would ask that you would deal with it. But this passage, it doesn't stop there. It picks up and it continues in verse 12. We're going to read the second passage. You ready? Here we go. And Jesus entered the temple. He just made this march, and he enters the temple. Amazing. The glory of the Lord traveling from the east across the Mount of Olives, upon which he once escaped, back to the place of his presence, to the temple. And what does he find? A ruckus. It says that he drove out all who sold and bought in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers." And the blind and the lame, they came to him in the temple, and he healed them. Jesus is confrontational, yes, but he is not lacking compassion either. He is still bleeding at heart for those that are in need. And then when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant, and they said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" And Jesus said to them, "Yes. Have you never read? Out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise." And leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany, and he lodged there. The second thing that Jesus confronts us on is this: Jesus confronts our idols. First up, he confronts your ideas. He wants to make sure they're true. And then the second is he confronts your idols. He wants to make sure that he's still best. We see in verses 12 through 17 that all this happens right after he marches into Jerusalem. And yet he not only comes into the capital city of Israel, he comes right to the crown jewel of Jerusalem. He comes to the very place upon which animal sacrifices were offered. Offerings were given up to God in praise. He comes to the Temple Mount. And yet as he arrives, what does he find? Does he hear the sound of prayer and worship? What should have been true? No. He hears instead the bustling of commerce in the distance. And yet as he comes even closer, he hears the air polluted with haggling and negotiating, the exchanging of money. This is no longer a place of prayer. This is a place of business. And it absolutely triggers him. Now we have to understand what's happening here, because this is Passover week. And so Passover week for Jerusalem would have been the most, if it would have been one of three, but it would have been likely the most celebrated week of the entire calendar year. And people are coming with the intent to pray and to offer up sacrifice to the Lord. And yet, many of them, they're coming from abroad. Like, they're not in Jerusalem. It would be like this. It would be like, if I actually remember this, when I went back to Texas A&M for my first football game after having moved away. Like, I lived there for 11 years. I became extremely desensitized to all the game day festivity. And yet when I left and I came back, I remember marveling at the euphoria. Like all of the pageantry and the energy in the room, like people coming from all over the nation to be a part of this one experience. So many people, a diversity of people gathering in one place because of one common love. That's what's happening here in Jerusalem. Like, these Jews have regathered back into this one city, and what we find is that they have come to offer sacrifice. What they could have done is they could have brought sacrifices with them. But for many of them, that's just too hard. And so they'll just show up and they'll buy something when they get there. They'll find a suitable sacrifice. And in order to do it, oftentimes many of them have to exchange their currency. Like, they have to show up and they have to kind of change bills and make sure that they're able to pay according to whatever the temple is accepting. And so what we find is that Jerusalem is a place where this should be pretty common practice. So why does it trigger Jesus? Like, why does he fly off the deep end? Why is he overturning tables and pouring out all of the coins that they've collected? Because just before Jesus began his ministry, the high priest Caiaphas, are y'all still with me? Yeah? The high priest Caiaphas, he decides to set up marquee retail space. And what he does is he takes all the vendors that used to sell sacrifices and exchange currency, he takes it from outside the temple walls and he puts them in the temple. And in doing so, he gets to scrape a little bit off the top. You see, what's happening in this story is Jesus is walking to the temple and he sees something that was never intended to be, and he knows that it's because of the idolatry in the hearts of the scribes that were entrusted with the temple's services. And it absolutely sets him off because they are abusing, using, taking advantage of people. It says that Jesus flips tables, drives out money changers. It says, and it's interesting, that he overturns the seats of those selling pigeons. Like, what's with the pigeons? Well, in Leviticus, what you find is that the pigeons were the offerings of the poor. That for those that could not afford rams or goats for sacrifice, for offerings, they could purchase pigeons, that this was the suitable offering for the poor. Jesus sees them extorting, taking advantage of the disadvantage, and it sets him off. To put it simply, Jesus is angry. Anger is motivated aggression. Anger is a secondary emotion. It's a reaction to some grievous wrongdoing. And it makes sense. Like when you think through the lens of psychologist Jeffrey Deffenbacher, he gave an anger model, and it posits that anger results from a progression of three things. It can be good and it can be bad. But here are the three things that do it. Number one, a trigger event. Anger results from a trigger event. What's Jesus' trigger event? It's the perversion of his Father's house. Number two, the intrinsic qualities of an individual. What's true of the person that's getting angry? Like, what are the intrinsic qualities within them that prompt them to become angry? Good news for us as we think about Jesus, there's not a sinful quality one that is true of him. He is perfect. And then the third thing, the individual's appraisal of a specific situation. What does Jesus appraise? Injustice and extortion. And he knows it because he quotes specifically from the prophet Isaiah. And I want to read this, Isaiah 56. 6 and 7, it says, "And the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord, to Yahweh, to minister to him, to love the name of Yahweh and to be his servants, everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it and holds fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain." What's the holy mountain? It's the Temple Mount. It's where the temple is. He, the Lord, will bring them to his mountain, and he will make them joyful in his house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on the altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. You see, these scribes, they take the purposes of God, the reason his temple exists, and they distort it. It was meant to be a place where people could come and they could love God and they could love others. And instead what happens is it becomes a place where people can leverage all of its resourcing to advance themselves selfishly. You see, they're idolatrous. And if we can just call it like it is, we are idolatrous too. We do this ourselves. We are all susceptible to missing the real Jesus because our affections are divided. One good way of thinking about this is that idolatry is infidelity against God. Like, that's what idolatry is. If ever you've wondered, it is infidelity, it's betraying, it's cheating on the Lord. That is what idolatry is, and we are all susceptible to it. It's looking at God, taking inventory of what he has to offer and saying, it's not gonna be enough. I think I can find something better. It would be like this. It would be as if we took a dog and we put you by yourself in a room with a golden retriever. That golden retriever is gonna be your best friend. It's gonna love you. But what happens if we put someone else in that room? I love dogs. That dog is going to be divided in his affections. Like, he's gonna want a little bit of you and he's gonna want a little bit of this guy. Like, he's gonna wanna be between two different people. Why? Because he will come to you so long as he gets the attention that he wants, and the minute that attention stops, he's going to move on to the next thing. Dogs are amazing. That's a pretty selfish mentality. And yet we live by it too. Don't miss this. We miss Jesus when we minimize him for something else. When our affections are divided between two different things, we miss him. So the question is, what? Like, what are you minimizing him for? This is just the application for it. Again, all of this should be taken home and should be put into place. What are you missing Jesus for? What is dividing calling to your affections? What could compel you to do this? I would argue it's one of four things. And this isn't original to me. These are the thoughts of other men. But four root idols. The first is power. Power. Like that longing for influence or recognition in the world. The second is control. A longing to have everything go according to plan. The third, comfort. A longing for pleasure. For things to just be good for once. And the last is approval. A longing to be accepted or desired. As Jesus confronts our idols, how do we know if we're falling prey to one of these? How do we figure it out? Well, we can just take a note from the text. What proves that the scribes are idolatrous in this moment? As Jesus comes and he confronts their idolatry, what do? It says they grow indignant towards him. They grow frustrated with him. How do you want to know if you are falling prey to some idol in your life? Is God asking you to do something that frustrates you? Something that bothers you? Something that annoys you? That's the surest way of figuring it out. Like, is there something in your life that God's like, hey, I need you to give me that. I need you to let me have it. Where you're like, not like anything else. You can have anything else. Don't take that. Like, that's the thing that I want to have. Can we not just have both? Can I not give you some? I'll even give you most, but let me have this thing. Whatever that is an idol in your life. And listen to me, friends, that fake, counterfeit God, it is sitting on the throne of your life, and it is not meaning for you any good. Like, you don't want to be led by it. You don't want to love after it. Like, it does not have your best interest at heart. And the good news is Jesus has shown up to confront it, to take it off the throne of your life and to take back what is rightfully his. He wants to sit on the throne of your life. The question is, will you let him? Will you respond to his confrontation? Jesus is a confrontational king. A king that is willing to confront us for our good. And yet he's not only that, he is a confrontational king in the sense that he is willing to be confronted for us so that we might get what we need. He doesn't just want to call you out. He stood in the gap when you could do nothing for yourself. Like, he was confronted in life by the idols of this world, and yet he overcame them all. Never succumbed to the temptations of this world. He's confronted in a death that he did not deserve, yet he willingly endured for the sake of you and me. And yet while he was confronted, Jesus stands today as victorious, risen, ready to rule. Not merely as a humble king mounted low on a colt, but as the King of Kings, who wants to take you home. The response for us is simple. It's to declare correctly, rightly, not missing who he is, but seeing him for all that he is. Hosanna, Hosanna, Lord, save me. Lord, save me. We're gonna turn to worship now, and we're gonna call out to him together. And I would ask, if he's calling you to be saved tonight, would you give your life to him? It's so simple. All you have to do is ask him, and he'll meet you in it. Let me pray. Jesus, we're grateful thankful for this time. Father, I feel from this stage my imperfection. Like I feel in this moment my inadequacy, God, to impart, the weight of what is in this text. And so I am begging you, God, please, by the power of your Spirit, move right now amongst the people here. Compel them, God, to lay down idols. Compel them, God, to rewrite their ideas, to get things right, God. If they have mistaken something, Lord, call us deeper into your presence, Jesus, please. Oh, a moment with you. It is greater than a million moments elsewhere. And it can make all the difference if only we would respond. And so friends, please, if you're here and you don't know him and you want to know him, if you're here and he's revealed himself to you, all you have to do to place your faith in Jesus is say, Jesus, I'm a sinner. I need help. I need rescue. And I know that you came to save me, that though you have come to confront me in my sin, you endured the confrontation that my sin deserved. And so I'm calling out on you, save me and take me home to where you are. If you're here, you can pray that and he will save you right now. And if you're here and you know him, man, do a really honest assessment. Jesus, is there an idol in my life that I'm unwilling to give, a sin I need to confess, an addiction I need to get accountability for, a desire that I have prioritized above you? Is there an idol I need to lay down? Is there an idea that's wrong that I've been mistaken about and I need to get clarity for? Oh, Jesus, have your way. We've gone long, but it's been worth it. Not because of what's been said, not because of what's been sung, but because, Jesus, you're here. And we want to meet with you now. So won't you do it? Won't you respond to him? We love you. It's in Jesus' name. Amen. Hey.